It's good to be here and have an opportunity to talk to you all about something that's quite passionate for me, and that's grade crossing safety as we look to develop passenger corridors and freight corridors around the U.S. And I want to talk a bit today about not only the passenger and the freight rail opportunity that's ahead of us. It's really unprecedented when it comes to the funding, but also about the issue of crossings on these corridors and solutions near and long term, and as well as to how to pay for it. So if we can go to the first slide. And am I doing that? I'm doing that then, right? How about that? Okay. So you've heard this, and as Nicole was saying, it's good to just kind of repeat it and make sure that people understand. But again, the bipartisan infrastructure law provided, again, great opportunity to develop rail corridors that we never had before. We talked about for many years we needed funding, and finally, here it is. And with this corridor ID process that people are involved with, for many years I've heard from people who want to develop their rail corridors, and they've asked, well, what do we need to do? And this starts giving you that roadmap to look at your passenger rail services, how they'll select corridors for development, and really prioritize some of those improvements and make them eligible for funding assistance. But it's going to be competitive, and there's likely more need than money. So again, looking at this is FRA's map. I'll certainly give Wynn Davis and Peter Schwartz credit for this. They've had the expressions of interest for 28 of the existing corridors, and 13 for extensions and 70 new corridors. And that's just on the expression of interest round of a call for projects. That's involving 45 states and other transportation entities that are within those states. So a lot going on out there. But also there is a renaissance in freight and a need for freight capacity. With additional freight trains that are running, with longer freight trains that are running, there's the need to not block crossings. There's the need to be able to move trains through communities. And that's important as well for economic development and creation of jobs. And there are projects that are available and eligible for FRA funding there through CRISI too. So again, there's a lot that's going on in both of these areas, and that's why I want to talk about something that I think that really impacts all of them, and that's safety. Safety is the foundation, and we all nod and say, yeah, that's exactly right. That's what we should do. But one of the issues that we get into is crossing safety. There is the need to reduce crashes. There's the need to reduce interruptions and incidents on the railroad. It's good for the passenger trains. It's good for schedules. It's good for freight. It's good for people and their safety and their mobility. And so it's necessary to really look at, when you're developing a corridor and you are looking at running more trains, how can you reduce the chances for crashes, injuries, property damage that can really interrupt an entire rail corridor for hours at a time if you have a derailment that results. So part of this has been to look at eliminating the vehicle conflicts with the trains, and also trying to avoid things like speed restrictions and making it safer as well for pedestrians. We've seen a lot of these photos before. There are impacts that we see: the crash, the people that are involved, infrastructure damage, trying to get that back online, hazmat situations that we've seen, terrible consequences. And then there's also secondary impacts, and that's delays to the cargo, delays to travelers. Hotshot trains, they're moving UPS, get delayed, your package doesn't get on time. That's the supply chain. May have to reroute around certain areas to keep trains moving on a subdivision. And so you could get into impacts throughout a region as well with a crossing incident. So it's an important issue to take a look at. Again, more crash pictures. You've seen all these before. Some of them I've been at. Some of them bring too strong of memories, to be quite honest. You see a lot of North Carolina things there, too, from my career at DOT. So I've never really cared a lot for crossings, as you can imagine. So what are the challenges that are out there? It's always been driver behavior. And, a lot of folks say, well, that's up to the individual. If they want to be foolish and pull out in front of the train, okay. But there's a crew that's involved in that crash. There's also equipment damage. There may be damage or injuries to people on board the train. There's delays in the infrastructure. So it's not an individual that's acting on their own. It does impact the transportation system, a system that we all want to make more reliable and be able to pump people and goods, right? So as we get into additional rail traffic, the signal systems get more complex. And yeah, technology can solve a lot of problems, but at the same time, technology costs money to maintain. It costs, there are flaws, there are, or false activations and so on that go with that as well. So as we start looking at corridors and modeling those, we find that crossings can present a mixed bag because you don't know what's going to happen if there's a crash, and also by virtue of having the crossing there, it can impact your operation or slow down trains if you're looking to go and maintain certain speeds. So when I hear from people, and when I was back on my state life, and also as a consultant, I get community leaders, they say, well, what can we do now? We want to develop our rail corridor. We want to have passenger service one day. We're just starting out. And you get in line on quarter ID. But what else can you do? What can you do now? What can you do to move things along? Well, generally that you're going to be using, unless you're going to do a lot of realignments of a railroad to speed up trains to over 100 miles an hour, generally where you're going to run your trains. And so you can always start looking at how do you develop that corridor through the elimination of crossings and making crossings safer because they serve the traffic that's on the railroad now, because it may be a freight route that's already carrying traffic. And so communities that are along a rail corridor that want to see service, that want to see trains come to their region, they have control in a lot of cases, as well as the states, over these crossings. They're public roads. They're municipal streets. They right now have Section 130 money that's available. All states get Section 130 money. Every state administers it a little bit differently, but it all is required to be administered based on a priority list. But there's also a segment of Section 130 money that can always be used for corridor projects, which I'll talk about in a bit. These projects are also really strong when you start talking about benefit costs, because safety really jacks it up pretty good. So you can get some good projects out and compete for money. And they can really stand on their own. Even if you don't succeed in having passenger trains in the next year or 2 or 3 or 4, those are improvements that can start getting benefits and dividends as well. And then finally, 2 important things. The collaboration of local governments and local officials shows that there's a commitment to understanding the railroad and making it safer and seeing it as a transportation resource. For instance, when they build a bypass of your city, you don't expect them to put traffic signals and intersections in it. You're going to have an improved road that works better. And there's an understanding of that from cities. At the same time, a better understanding about the railroad is needed, and being able to demonstrate that as well. And I'll mention that collaborating with railroads on safety puts you in a really nice position when you start talking about other improvements down the road. Because my own experience in North Carolina was I was working with Norfolk Southern and CSX on closing crossings and making them safe for 10 years before we started doing the rail improvements. And it was very natural to move on to that next round of improvement, because guess what? A lot of those capacity improvements involved crossings because we needed sidings, and you can't build sidings and block crossings to store trains. So we went through a lot of different things, and some of these are terms you might understand or have heard before. The Sealed Corridor Project. We did that beginning in the early 1990s, did quite a bit of testing on different kinds of devices. People always thought that, well, the sealed quarter is just where you put 4-quadrant gates or medians and you treat crossings. Well, no, it's a lot more than that. It's looking at what do you do with the crossing? Does the crossing need to stay in place? Do you close the crossing? And then how do you treat the crossing if it does stay in place? And how does it interact with other crossings? So we did this project in North Carolina some years ago, did the engineering diagnostics. Quite proud of this because I think it really showed what we could do with different kinds of devices and raised the bar for safety. We were able to equip all the public crossings with gates and lights and what we call enhanced devices between Raleigh and Charlotte, and also looked at private crossings as well, had money for that by virtue of being on a designated corridor. It was the first of its kind in the U.S. We were very fortunate to get support from the FRA and have since then in North Carolina and a lot of other places to look at closing these crossings, to improving crossings and associated roadway improvements. Because when you start talking about closing a crossing, just don't think you put up a barrier and that's all you do. You've got to really think about how you move around the traffic because that's important too. And there's a lot of partnerships that we did. Some were harder than others, but with municipalities and with MPOs and having people understand and working with people and trying to understand what they're facing when it comes to this particular area. So overall, I'd like to show some of these percentages. It's old numbers, but really, we looked at medians. We were able to reduce gate runners by 77%. We're able to have 4-quadrant gates at 86% reduction. We also use some longer gate arms, but they're not really ideal. That's one thing we learned out of that project too. But the other thing that we did, that we moved into, is looking at these corridors for improvements. It's not simple as just going out and taking 3 or 4 people and doing a diagnostic and saying, hey, this is what we'll go do. Because you've really got to sell the process, and you've got to look at it with the community and very much understand what their traffic patterns are, how all of that works with crossings, what are their needs long-term for transportation as they look to live on the railroad and live on a railroad where not only is there a lot of freight trains, but you're looking to add passenger trains too. You may be adding a passenger train that comes into the station and activates the gates while it says at the station. So there's a lot of things to think about there too. So we came up with these traffic separation studies. And what it was, we were able to go and take a look at a given set of crossings within a particular area. Usually we're within a municipality or, it's extra jurisdictional areas or even MPOs. And we did an engineering study as to what are all the crossings, and what kind of improvements are needed near term that we could try to fund and go after money and make some really quick improvements over the next few years. But there are also longer term projects. What is your blueprint eventually to have grade separations? To how do you want the railroad to look one day? And so we're able to do that too. And in fact, there were kind of middle improvements. And what those middle improvements are is, let's say, for instance, your highway department or your local highway authority has a plan for a new grade separation, a new boulevard that goes over, but at the same time, there's an at-grade crossing. So what can you do about, improving the network to connect to that project that we're investing public dollars in? So a lot of good things that can come out of those traffic separation studies. There's a lot of public involvement that is part of that too. Because what we wanted to make sure is that a consultant can come in and do a study about anything. And you can get it done, and a city can say, no, we don't want to do that. What is key is making sure you have the relationships with the towns and the municipalities and the MPOs, and you're working with them. So when you come to the end of that journey, we always talk about being on a journey. So you come to the end of that journey, everybody's in agreement. You don't want anything in a safety study that is never going to be implemented. We don't like to do that as practitioners. It's not good from a liability point of view, and it's not good from good public policy. So we want to make sure that ultimately that document is a vision plan of what people want to do with rail crossings. And so there's all kinds of different approaches. You see some examples of visualization. You go to the community, you start talking with people. Of course, people are against it. People are against a lot these days. And that's a sport. That's probably our most popular sport these days, and I don't blame people in some cases. But you got to continue to work with folks. I'm against this project. Okay, but if you had to have it, tell me what you like about it or what you wish we might do different. Oh, okay. And then you start having a dialogue with folks. The traffic separation study process, it really does this, it's a framework for a way to go into a community, to look at the crossings, to go through processes of having, depending on what your community is, having early interaction with the public to determine what their issues are, what's important to them, and then coming back with some improvements. And sometimes it goes on. I can tell you that there were studies that we did in '97 in one community, and we were still working with them in 2015 to build the projects because we kept communication up with those folks to let them know we were going to follow through and take an approach based on what they wanted. You also go through a lot of analysis here. We use a tool, we call it INSET, that goes through and it looks at a lot of different factors that go into a plan and starts to we call it like a normalization of particular, non-associated factors that help you make some decisions. So you're looking at traffic, you're looking at community, but the same way there's some good ways of pulling those things together to make sure that that you're not doing something arbitrarily or capricious, as they would say. But long term, I'd say the brass ring was having a grade separation because there's a lot of these communities that are growing around the railroads too, and the railroad has been really an impossible thing to cross. It has just been a barrier there. And so building these grade separations and finally having some funding and some ways to do it, and it was a real important. And why do we talk about grade separations? And why do you talk about it when you've got technology and you can put all kinds of gates in and such? Well, grade separations are a lot more reliable. And when we talk about grade separations, it could be either a railroad over, it could be the highway over. It works both ways. They're not cheap. They're not cheap at all, but there's good reason for them. You avoid collisions. This is a place where there was a net grade crossing that was signalized, but unfortunately a piece of electrical equipment was led over the crossing. It got stuck in front of Amtrak's Carolinian heading north. And so those things happen. Traffic issues on the roadways. Every time a train comes through a community and you got all these interconnected signals, you realize the train preempts all the signals, and so it kind of changes everything that's going on in your downtown, and it takes a while for that to recover. So the less of those situations you have where suddenly all the signals are preempted and it changes all your downtown patterns, grade separations, you don't have that. Now, that doesn't mean you can close everyone too, but the fewer, the better. Another reason, it doesn't happen as much, but it's still there. System failure, associated delays. In the southeast, we have hurricanes. Some places, the power may not come on for a week or so. They put generators out to keep the batteries charged and the signal. Guess what? People go get a generator, cut the chain, take it home. But still, signals, it can happen. It's not 110% fail-safe, so that's a concern too. And then we talk about pedestrian access, and we want to connect our communities even more. That's a big issue, and it's very much understandable that the railroads in a lot of cases have been the barriers. So having grade separations and having ways to route people and move people across the railroad, that works really well too. And then when you start looking at maintenance of crossings and all the dollars that are involved in the risk and the crashes and everything else, you start to pay for a grade separation too, if you think about it long term. And we're building infrastructure to last long term. We are actually changing, it's a new course in history, to build new infrastructure that's going to last another 150 years. So there's an approach there as well. Now, when we look at all of these crossings, again, traffic separation study, the processes, the public involvement, the negotiations, the discussions, we have to think about equity between communities. They need to be able to get across the railroad. They need, there are people who are challenged or mobility challenged, making it so that they can get across the railroad better. So we think about those things as well. Of course, safety. Prioritization. How do you make sure that you're going at the most needy project first? So having data and understanding the benefit cost is really important there. And of course, funding. We got to have funding. So with that said, I want to tell you a little bit about how to do it. So I had mentioned before, Section 130 money, FHWA has continued to have this funding. It's not going to be enough to get you a grade separation. It might be enough to start getting some studies, some of the work done through your state planning and research money. And so there's a lot of opportunity there, but also there's CMAQ, Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Funds. Depending on how they're administered by your state, there may be an opportunity to advance a project there because of pollution, of not stopping cars waiting for trains. And now we get into the good stuff, the bipartisan infrastructure law. There are a lot of opportunities there to compete for grade separation money, even if you're early on. If a city did a traffic separation study and they put together and they developed a project and put it in for, of course, you'd want to go for the rail crossing elimination program. That's the, that's the targeted one for these kinds of projects, but it's also eligible for CRISI, for RAISE projects, depending on how you structure them. There's different ways to structure them to make them more competitive. And then there's other grants that are out there that are not directly related to crossings, but these are the opportunities that we see and that we've talked about. And then going back to the rail crossing elimination grants, they can be used for grade separations. They can be used for consolidation of crossings, where you may build a new, safer at-grade crossing, if that's what you want to do, and close others. Building the network around so that people can get those crossings, upgrading crossings. For planning, if you want to do a comprehensive planning of your crossings, you can have a planning grant through this program as well. And then also technology. I hope we never stop looking at better ways to make our crossing safer. And there's a lot of opportunity out there, but it's hard, and it takes a lot of patience and processes, but somebody's got to do it and continue to do it, so I certainly salute that. So when you start looking at capital improvements, with all of these, we talk about competitive grants. You got to make sure it's in line with the policy objectives of both Congress and the White House when you're applying funds. It's always important to read that notice of funding availability. Benefit cost analysis is very strong with any kind of grant application, and making sure that you got to think about what all goes into that. What are all the benefits that go into that particular project? Your project objectives, non-federal match is a big thing. In fact, I'll say that if you are working with your railroad and your railroad is willing to put some money into that grade separation, that's strong. I always say that's strong money, even if it's a small amount. It shows railroad interest in that project, which is really big when they start looking at doling out money. And then also, you're going to get into federal regulations. You've got to do your environmental documents and so on. And I think we all have to deal with that. So doing grants, I always like to give a little bit of advice. You need to start early when it comes to grants. You don't wait for the NOFO to come out and say, oh, let's apply for something. You really need to have a really solid plan. You need to know what the benefit cost is. You need to make sure people are on board with that plan. Your railroads are on board, your community's on board, that you have local funding, you have match on that. You start to, you pull those things together early on, well before you ever hear about, because we know there's going to continue to be competitive grants. So you get all that together, you do your homework. You always got to follow the funding, too. There's plenty of places to go and figure out, what's coming out. And there's consultants that will tell you that stuff, too. No plug intended. You got to collaborate, make sure you're ready on that. And then you got to look at the big picture of these overall projects and be patient, because you don't always win on your first time out. So kind of my takeaways on this is that plan long range, start early, get buy-in, get people on board. don't shove anything down anybody's throat. That hasn't worked for a long time, never really did very well, but it's not working at all now. Chip away at smaller projects. Try to find a win. I don't know if we do very much on trying to find wins and move forward anymore these days, but that's still a good thing if you can do it. And then position for those larger project opportunities. So with that, I will stop. Thank you all.